Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you today. I am very, very pleased to introduce our keynote speaker today. Patty Krawec is an Anishinaabe and Ukrainian writer and speaker belonging to Lac Seul First Nation in Treaty 3 territory and residing in Niagara Falls. She is active with the Fort Erie Native Friendship Center and Strong Water Singers. She is the co-host of the Medicine for the Resistance podcast, and in November 2021, after 3 years of personal fundraising, co-founded the Nikanagana Foundation with journalist Nora Loretto and Blackfoot activist Terrell Tailfeathers. Nikanagana challenges settlers to pay their rent for living on Indigenous lands and then disperses that money to Indigenous people and organizations who are building their communities in a variety of creative ways. Her work has been published widely. She posts podcasts and essays with some regularity on multiple Substacks. Her book, Becoming Kin, An Indigenous Call to Unforgetting the Past and Reimagining Our Future, was published in September 2022 by Broadleaf Books. Today, Patty will be speaking about Biska Biang, the importance of returning to ourselves. Please welcome Patty Krawec.
Thank you so much for having me. I hear that Nora Loretto spoke with you guys last year. And yes, my Substack right now, this felt like the right time to be reading Fanon. So if you're interested in my thoughts, you would want to subscribe. It's chapter by chapter. I'm going through Wretched of the Earth and all the things that makes me think. Anin bojo, wabna nanangonkwe indigenakaz, adikdotum. Obishko Kang and Dunjaba, Ojibwe, Nishnabé Kwayandao. I introduced myself in Ojibwe following the protocols I was taught to give my name, my clan, my community, known officially as Lac Seul First Nation, but what we call the place of the White Pine Narrows. Introductions offer more than a name, of course. Excuse me. They offer more than a name. They offer social context. How we're located geographically and temporally. These social connections are a way of answering that question, who claims you? I read today in an LA Times op-ed by Elliot Kukla, Jewish, about the impact of intergenerational trauma of genocide. He wrote, according to ancient Jewish holy texts, saving a single life is the same as saving a whole world, because each of us contains distinctive cities of relationships, irreplaceable geographies of passions, and deep oceans of memories. Each of us contains distinctive cities of relationships, irreplaceable geographies of passions, and deep oceans of memories. This is what I mean when I talk about who I claim and who claims me. I am thinking about those cities of relationship, irreplaceable geographies of passions, deep oceans of memories. Clearly, this idea of reciprocal claiming is not unique to Indigenous peoples. Any diasporic people do this, asking about your relationships and your geographies, looking for that place of connection and also for context. Because the answer to the question of who claims you is, as Kukla notes, about more than our immediate family relationships. What communities are you part of? What communities claim you? What collective histories have you inherited? These are the things that we need to return to. Everyone, of course, should do this, thinking about the various communities we're in relationship with, what that says about who we are and who we're connected to. Max Leboiron, Métis, through their book, Pollution is Colonialism, introduced me to the practice of identifying people's nation or affiliation, even those who are, as Max uses the term, unmarked, which is not to say that they're white, although typically it is white writers and speakers who are unmarked. The rest of us bringing various degrees of difference. Those who are designated in Max's, and now my own writing is unmarked, are those who have not offered an identification of their nation or affiliation. It's a practice I'm beginning to incorporate, so forgive me if I'm inconsistent as I go through this today. But it's an important practice as we think about newcomers, as we think about ourselves and our positions working with newcomers, to introduce ourselves with our place, with those cities of relationship and geographies that we inherit. Biskabiang means to return to ourselves, which also means marking ourselves, thinking about our own communities and geographies. It's important to me to speak my language, stumbling as it is, when I introduce myself, because too often government people, teachers, and missionaries learned our languages only to gain access to our communities. They never asked, in the words of Sarah Augustine, Tiwa descendant, if we had any good news for them. And so I appreciate this opportunity to speak with you all, to speak about learning language and helping us return to ourselves, to think about who we are, and to approach the communities that we work with that question, that curiosity. What good news do you have for us as Canadians for however long we've been Canadian? Of course, I speak only for myself. The books and the people that I cite are a kind of relationship by which you can know me. Our friends, after all, say much about who we are. And as Sarah Ahmed, Pakistani, British, and Australian, points out in her writing, citation is relationship. But the perspectives and ideas that I offer you are my own. They may be shared by others, but I don't pretend to represent Indigenous peoples broadly or even the Anishinaabe. The ideas that emerge from connections are my own, and this is a way of accepting responsibility for the consequences of my words. We think about family connections. Through my father, Roy, I'm connected to Indigenous peoples in Canada and globally, but specifically through the Ojibwe Anishinaabe community in northwestern Ontario. He's fond of saying that we're descended from Noah and Moses, and indeed Noah and Moses Wesley both are mentioned in the Treaty 9 book by John Long. They picked up treaty money in Fort Albany and brought it down to the community at Lac Seul. Through my mother, Vicky, I'm connected with refugees and migrants. My mother's family are German Ukrainian people who came over to Canada following the Second World War. My grandmother being part of that group of Germans that Catherine the Great brought into Ukraine to displace the Ukrainians, and they lived on farms and in communities located mostly along the Dnieper River. She married a Ukrainian man, George Litnewski, who was my mother's father. He passed away, he died during World War II, during the early years of World War II. My grandmother then fled through Poland, finding safety in Germany. The man that we always knew as George Litnewski, my grandfather, he deserted from the Red Army, was caught with a number of others, executed in a mass execution, but survived. He and another man fell into this mass grave, and they survived. And the man said to him, if you want to survive, stay still. And so they laid there in this mass grave. And eventually they climbed out, and they separated to stay safe, my grandfather eventually making his way to what was by then American-occupied Germany. And of course, he had no papers, because when the Red Army executes you, they don't leave your documents in your pocket. So when they wanted to refugee, the only papers that they had were my grandmother's papers from her first husband. And so the lawyer said, I can work with that. And my grandfather lived his entire life with another man's name. And I think about that a lot, because I wonder what that must have been like for him, right? It's hard enough to be the second husband. But to be the second husband and your wife referring to you by her dead husband's name, a ghost you can never compete with. He's buried under that name. And it's a story that we always knew as growing up. I mean, he loved telling the story and showing us the scars. So it's a story that we always knew, that George Litnewski was not his real name. But it wasn't until about a year before he passed that he actually told us what his name was, because he was terrified. He was terrified of government finding out. He was terrified of the Russians finding out, and understandably so. I also think about the communities that I'm part of, right? Because when we think about the geographies and cities that each of us contain, it's not just our family relationships. So there's the Christian church that I grew up in. I call it my misspent youth, where I developed ideas about morality and responsibility, and where I also learned to critique the ideas of morality and responsibility that I was taught in that place. I belong to the field of social work. This is the field in which I obtained my degree and where I worked for 20 years in varying capacities, primarily in child welfare, where I learned to review history for the patterns that it reveals about a family's current crisis. And it occurred to me a couple of months ago that that was essentially what I had done with the book. I had done a history review of Canada and the United States, and then I wrote a service plan. That's what social workers do. And when I mentioned this to a friend of mine, having had this epiphany about my book being, you know, a history review with a service plan, he said, my friend who was an early reader says to me, Patty, I saw that immediately upon writing. I'm like, of course you did that. You're a social worker. This is your training. This is what you do. Through the field of social work, I became involved with the labor movement. I was both, an active union member, and I was on the executive. I'm still a big fan of the labor movement, just how I got connected with Nora Loretto, because it's a seat of organizing. It's a place where, we can move past, basic labor relations, which tends to be a lot of the work that unions do, but thinking more broadly about advocating for a better world for the people we serve, not just for ourselves. And then now my primary relationship is with the Friendship Center movement. As you heard, I'm an active member of the Fort Erie Friendship Center and the Strongwater Singers, a drum group that is getting increasingly invited to perform all over Ontario, Southern Ontario, into the US. And the money that we earn from these performances is held collectively. It's not, it's not like if they were here today and they got paid whatever they got paid, the money wouldn't be divided up among the individual members of the group. It's held collectively, and actually the Nikanagana Foundation holds the funds that are designated for the Strongwater Singers, and it's then dispersed to community members. We just put in a cistern for a local elder who lives in the Niagara region and hasn't had safe drinking water for about 2 decades now. We buy groceries, we help people, with gas money, so it's money that we hold collectively and then use to help our local community. So those are the layers of relationship, the social groups that I belong to, and it is a long introduction, but it provides you with a lot of context for the things that are important to me, the relationships that have shaped me, the communities that I feel a level of responsibility towards. Thinking about the harm that I did while I was part of those communities because I was uncritical about the role that I was playing. And then by analyzing that, I can then shape my own activism. Because if I caused a particular harm, I can't always undo that harm, but I can shape my activism to prevent further harm in similar ways. Canada likes to think of itself as a nation of immigrants. But the reality is really more complex than that. The people who live within Canada, as you know, have very different relationships with the government depending on their legal status. So I'm going to take a moment to talk about language. These words all describe relationship to government. They are not identities. They are politically constructed categories that have specific relationship to the society, to the government. So of course, immigrants are people who come to a place and then adapt themselves to the existing political system. But we know that that's not what happened at the time of settlement. The Haudenosaunee offered the Dutch the two-row wampum agreement, which I don't know if you're familiar with. I always get the colors mixed up, so if there's a Haudenosaunee in the room, please correct me. In my mind right now, it's a white background with 2 purple rows. Or it's a purple background with 2 white rows. I always get them mixed up, and I apologize. The point being that it's a single color background with 2 rows. And 1 row represents the Indigenous peoples, the Haudenosaunee, it's specific to the Haudenosaunee, but it's also the Haudenosaunee and all their allies. Because when Canada and when the British and the US came up with the Treaty of Ghent, everybody, even people who didn't sign that treaty, respect the border between our countries, right? So the Haudenosaunee and their allies agreed that they would live on the one boat according to their ways, and the Dutch, and presumably their allies, agreed that they would live in the other boat. And so we're not talking about a border where the Indigenous people all live on the west of the Mississippi and the settlers all live on the east of the Mississippi. What we're talking about is our community will live our way, your community will live your way, and we won't interfere with each other. This was a strategy of governance that had emerged through a lot of, through conflict between various Indigenous nations. People get into conflict. Treaties are a way of resolving conflict. And so this was a way of life that had developed here in the Americas. We've got the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee living in the dish with one spoon territory, which is fairly long, going along the St. Lawrence and all the way around the Great Lakes. So both of us had communities here. It wasn't like we had hard boundaries between us. but we agreed to live in ways that didn't interfere with each other. And so that was what was offered to the settlers when they came. That was the existing system of governance to which they would have come, to which they would have entered if they came as immigrants. But of course, the early settlers did not come as immigrants. They came as settlers, as people who come to a place and then impose a new political system on top of it. Black people are not settlers. African-Canadian human rights lawyer Anthony Morgan has coined the term displanted, which I really like. It refers to the displacement and replanting of Black people, which has happened from the moment of the transatlantic slave trade. And then, most recently, I think the biggest example I can think of right now would be Africville, a community that was deliberately underfunded. And then, problems resulted because of that underfunding, and that was used not to deal with the problems, but to relocate the population of Africville. So I like that term, displanted. But Barbadian poet Camu Braithwaite uses the term arrivance. The band manager was angry at my grandmother for leaving her husband and said, "You need to go back to your husband." And she said things I won't repeat. And then, so he said, "Okay, fine. So your younger two sons are Lions now. They're not Wesleys anymore." Which meant that my father and his younger brother Angus lost their Indian status. Which meant they didn't go to residential schools because his brothers all went to residential schools, but that change in legal status didn't really matter to the people in Sioux Lookout who still treated them like they were Indians. My father actually had to do a DNA test to prove that he and his brothers had the same father so that he could get his status reinstated, because all of his government paperwork said that Joe Lyons was his father. And he only did that so that I would be able to access Indian status, which I was able to pass down to my son. My children all have Indian status, but my grandson will not have Indian status because his mother, her family was enfranchised. So although they remained connected to their community, they're not legally Indians. So my little grandson, who's growing up speaking the language, connected to ceremony, connected to community, will no longer be legally an Indian. And of course, Aboriginal is still part of our current lexicon. It's really fallen out of favor. Ab means not, so it kind of suggests not original. And Native tends to be used more often in the US. You don't hear a lot of Canadians using the term Native. The fact is, whatever term you use, somebody will correct you, right? Everybody's got a preference. So, and really, we never thought of ourselves collectively in that sense before, right? Because I was Ojibwe, my friend would have been Cree, my other friend would have been Seneca, another friend would be Lakota, and so we didn't think of ourselves as kind of a collective group because we had no other against which to compare ourselves. There was no need for us to think of ourselves as a collective group of people existing in this place until colonists got here. And then colonists, of course, famously called us Indians because, he got lost. Just as a little aside, Columbus was not looking for spices. Columbus was looking for allies. This was the time of the Spanish Reconquista when Muslims were being pushed out of Spain. And so what Columbus was looking for was allies in India. And so he was trying to take a route around to get to India. I did not know that. And so much of my work is uncovering these histories that we were not told. That's the history review that I did, was uncovering these histories that we were not told. And so all of these names are both correct and useful and also wrong. And so when somebody corrects you and says, please don't call, I would recommend that you not use the term Indian unless you're using it as a legal term. But if you say First Nations or Native or Indigenous or Aboriginal and somebody corrects you to something else, don't be saying, well, Patty said I should say that. Just say, okay, and use whatever their preferred term is, because they're all a little bit right and they're all a little bit wrong. If you know somebody's nation, use it. If you're if you're introducing, like I was introduced today, I was not introduced as an Indigenous woman, I was introduced as Anishinaabe. So if you know somebody's nation, use it. Biskabayang is about returning to ourselves. And for the Ojibwe people, the word contains the idea of returning to the forest, which makes sense. We're, the Northwestern Ojibwe Anishinaabe peoples, we're a woodlands people. If you've ever been to the far north of Ontario, it's all woods and swamp and little tiny lakes. It's absolutely beautiful. And so for us, so it makes sense that the idea of returning to ourselves, for us, would contain the idea of going back into the woods, going back into the forest. But as we think about it, we can also think about it as the histories and relationships that we've inherited, the cities and geographies that we have been cut off from and that we have deprived others of retaining. I often begin my remarks by sharing a definition of racism that was developed by Ruth Wilson Gilmore, African American, because I find it such a useful metric for assessing oppression, and it sets the context for the discussion of history that's to come. It comes from her book, Golden Gulag, Prisons, Surplus, Crisis, and Opposition in California. She writes, racism is, specifically, the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production or exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerabilities to premature death. And that is what we're talking about when we're talking about racism, but it is also a very useful metric for all the other ways in which people are made vulnerable. We're talking about group-differentiated vulnerabilities to premature death, which is death at any age that could be avoided. Not about hurt feelings or being excluded, although these things matter, but about who is dying in disproportionate numbers, because that helps us to look at the systems that set up or exploit those realities. And I begin my presentation with Ruth's definition because I want to be clear when we proceed into Canadian history and policymaking that this is not about people's feelings or circumstances being complicated. State-sanctioned or extra-legal production of group-differentiated vulnerabilities to premature death is not complicated. It is a clear metric that you can use to identify how different groups are impacted by specific policies. Thinking about this in terms of groups rather than individuals helps us make the kind of assessments that address inequities. Which groups are experiencing group-differentiated vulnerabilities to premature death, to poverty, to other exclusions? We can analyze almost any policy through this lens. And to this definition, I now add an observation by La Paperson, a diasporic settler of color, who said, primitive accumulation involves not only the gathering of natural resources as assets, but also the externalizing of the cost of that accumulation in the form of contaminated water, disease, and other traumas to the natural, not propertied, that is, indigenous world. And of course, to be subject to anti-indigenous technologies, Paperson says, does not require you to be indigenous. Which is to say that the policies that exclude and work against indigenous peoples can also result in harm to those living in poverty or in diasporic communities or others who also bear the consequences of those externalized costs of accumulation. Settlement of Canada was and is a way for governments to assert political presence, to secure borders. Migration does not equal colonialism, but it can support it. My oldest worked for years planting trees, fighting forest fires, and doing arborist work. Seasonal jobs that meant he moved with the season depending on what the work was needed done, right? You plant trees in the spring, you fight forest fires increasingly all year round. You do kind of arborist work that he was doing was in the fall. And many people live this way. My middle son works as a chef. He's traveling Canada by getting jobs in the places that he wants to visit. Entire communities once lived this way, moving with the seasons depending on what was being harvested. This is a way to live very lightly on the land, to live with the land, and it requires a very particular knowledge base. It isn't a practical way of life for large communities. Agriculture, we often see agriculture as being, a form of civilizing, right? We've got the nomads, and then it progresses, right? Agriculture is a sign of progress. But agriculture is really just related to the size of the community. If you look through the archaeological record, you'll see societies go back and forth depending on the density of their population. So it's not a measure of progress or civilization. But describing people as nomadic is a way to dismiss their relationship to land. It suggests that they're not using it properly, and these migratory people need to be civilized and made to settle down in one place. As I described with my paternal family, people who had historically traveled around northwestern Ontario, they were made to settle down into reserves. This remains a prevailing attitude in modern colonial projects that impact Indigenous people around the world, like the Bedouin, whose lands and ability to travel are interfered with. After the War of 1812, Canada and the US had what was then the world's longest border. And the best way to secure a border is to move people alongside it. Canada and the US did this by giving away thousands and thousands of acres of land, but in order to do this, they had to remove the Cree, Lakota, Blackfoot, and others. In his book, Clearing the Plains, James Dashik, Unmarked Canadian, describes the policy of starvation enacted by the Macdonald government in the late 19th century. When I went to Iqaluit to visit my son, the chef, who was working there, we went to the Welcome Center and I read about the Cold War settlement of what is now Nunavut, the establishment of a US military base and subsequent movement of Inuit off the land. They went from igloos to iPads in one generation because Canada and the US needed to assert a social and military presence in the far north. That's not hyperbole or my opinion, that's what it says on the display that I read. Settlement can also be thought of as a process of disconnecting people from those distinctive cities of relationship, those irreplaceable geographies of passions and their deep oceans of memory. Removing people from those geographies and then replacing those geographies with the identity of the dominant, mostly white, mostly Christian Canadian culture. And we all, Black and Indigenous people, migrants, refugees, diasporic settlers of color, can participate in that process, becoming people without history, without any identity at all. Finding a way to adapt to a new group of people or a new country is one thing, but disconnecting ourselves or requiring people to disconnect themselves is another. This shows up in multiple ways. Newcomers often become hypercorrect imitators. And that's a term that refers to the way that a newcomer to a place, it talks specifically about women who marry into patriarchal societies, becoming kind of more the ideal woman than even the women who are in those societies are like. But you know, minorities, newcomers to countries can do that as well. They become hyper-correct imitators, more Canadian than the so-called old stock Canadians. And this is, you know, they do this in the hopes of being seen as unthreatening. We can think about all the ways that Muslims in the post-9/11 world work to prove to everybody that they're not dangerous, that they can be good citizens. Policies often favor some groups and not others based on ideas of who is more easily assimilated. Peoples whose stories can be more easily replaced with the ideas of what it means to be Canadian. There was a lot of op-eds and writing being done about the differential treatment of Ukrainian refugees, for example, Afghans and others, and I saw a question about Palestinians on the board, haven't received the same degree of welcome. We see newsreels of Ukrainians being billeted or housed by community groups, while other migrants are often held in detention or subject to safe third country agreements, which I saw there was another question about that, so I know you guys are thinking about it. Ruth's definition is worth bringing into this conversation again, because the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production of group-differentiated vulnerabilities to premature death, refugees and migrants are that population when they're subject to safe third country agreements, when they're held in detention centers. I remember the newsreels of Ukrainians being welcomed in Poland with open arms while Poland was building an expanded refugee detention center to house Afghan refugees. So very differential, we see that differential policy development. Some groups are just plain seen as easier to assimilate. Others are seen as too different and possibly a threat. I worked in child welfare, and there are groups that are more challenging, that aren't as easily assimilated or easily relatable to from the position that I occupied at the time, and often families from those groups had their files closed early, not because there was no risk of harm or because there was no role for us or another organization, but because the challenges posed by their position were things that we could not overcome, either because we lacked the time to engage with them well, or we lacked the resources to engage with them at all. We had no workers who spoke their language. Translators were hard to find. I worked with one family that had come up from Haiti, and they crossed the Canada-US border, and they were involved with us, and we were looking for a translator, and we couldn't find a Creole translator, so they sent us a French translator. And everybody from the Caribbean can laugh about that because the translator would translate in French, and the kids would look at me like, what did she say? They didn't understand her. They understood my English better than her French. So access to translators is a real challenge. The myth of multiculturalism, The idea that multiple cultures exist within Canada, the mosaic rather than the US melting pot, has been official policy since 1971. It was actually a response to the civil rights movement and became part of the story of Canadian progress. We were all included in this mosaic, but the mosaic removes Indigenous peoples who are based in territory and treaty. It removes us from our place and renders us racial minorities in our own land. It ignores our history and our connection with this place, but more importantly, it ignores the history of how Canada came to exist. It removes us from the land while simultaneously erasing the story of that removal. Settler Canadians get a history of exploration and conquest. Migrants and others get a history of finding safety. Black Canadians get a history of freedom from slavery, although slavery did exist in the colonies that became Canada, and for decades after its abolition, those who fled enslavement were returned to the US. And communities like Africville, which I mentioned, were under-resourced and then demolished. And of course, corporations in Canada, like the Hudson's Bay Company and others, Canada did not have unfree labor in that sense, but they certainly benefited from the unfree labor of the American South. Multiculturalism as it exists reduces the stories and histories of migrants to costumes and stereotypes, and has done little to actually address the racial inequities that they face. If anything, it often reifies those inequities because it assumes a central culture around which the rest of us are different or unique. We're the ones with cultural practices that need to be accommodated. It results in the tourist gaze. Participating in multicultural events allows settler Canadians to get that little bit of spice in their life and then go home without really thinking about the impacts that Canadian society has had. Ethnic heroes and holidays are special against Canadian norms. We think about who's statutory holidays, right? If I want to go to ceremony, I would have to take that as a vacation day, whether or not I celebrate Christmas. We often find ourselves appreciating difference without recognizing colonial and economic relations that marginalize people, and that often results in blaming marginalized people for not succeeding, for not fitting in. We emphasize their contributions to Canada, the good or deserving migrant versus those who need additional support because they've experienced greater consequences of these group differentiated vulnerabilities I mentioned at the beginning. They experienced them in their homeland and then again when they come here. We know that migrants from some communities have more difficulty securing housing and stable employment than others who are seen as more easily assimilated, more like us, an attitude that gets to the core of the problem of multiculturalism. It retains an idea of us around which others are varying degrees of different, interesting perhaps, good food, but not like us. Deliberate diversity and inclusion that seeks only to extend the reach of Canada's single story into immigrant and migrant communities. Diversity and inclusion to what end? Do we just want to find ways to assimilate them more effectively? Or are we willing to listen to what good news they may have for us and allow ourselves to be transformed by their inclusion? So how do we return to ourselves and in turn invite our clients to maintain that connection? The work to deracialize Canada, using decolonization as a metaphor for deracializing work, is attractive because it fits into Canada's image as a nation of immigrants, a mosaic in which we are all welcome and safe. But if we are truly going to be a place of safety and welcome, we need to consider the colonial legacies and policies that we have inherited and ask ourselves who is made vulnerable by these policies. What group differentiated vulnerability to premature death is being ignored or exploited? Decolonization, as Tak and Yang have noted, is not a metaphor. Tak is Indigenous, and I can't even remember the name of it. See, I knew I wasn't going to be able to do this correctly. I'm just learning this practice of marking people. But Tak is an Indigenous woman, Yang is a diasporic settler of color. So as they've noted, it is not a metaphor. Decolonization is the work of confronting Canada's own colonial legacy and how that continues to impact the ways in which Indigenous peoples and migrants live within these borders. Decolonization means thinking about the way we externalize the cost of our society into land that is unpopulated, but it is Indigenous land. So we unsettle our own creation stories. If part of the work of settlement is to disconnect people from their history and adopt the identity of the dominant culture, then we need to refuse that severing. We need to mark ourselves, as I described earlier. We mark ourselves thinking with clarity about our own belonging and the legacies contained within the histories that we bring with us. What each of us contains, those cities, those distinctive cities of relationship, irreplaceable geographies of passion, and deep oceans of memories that each of us contain. We look at our own histories and those of our profession, our field of study, our communities, our nations. We examine, as I have begun to outline for you, the stories that we tell about Canada and who it is. We refuse to erase the stories that make us uncomfortable, the stories in which Canadians have not been the good guys, because we cannot change what we refuse to admit. Canadian politicians are very good at making apologies, but not very good at looking at the roots of those actions, like the beliefs about Japanese people or Ukrainians that resulted in internment camps, beliefs about refugees that resulted in ships like the Komagata Maru in 1914 with mostly Punjabi people on board, or the St. Louis, which was turned away in 1939, sending Jewish refugees back to Europe, or the Sun Sea, which held Tamil refugees in 2010, or, as I saw another question, Palestinians from Gaza fleeing the violence there. There are also beliefs about Indigenous peoples and Black people that continue to shape policy, not necessarily deliberately, but by our absence. We're not considered. We're not at the table. And so we often look at these incidents in isolation, but we have to see them as a pattern. Angela Davis, African American, describes radical as meaning grasping by the root. The process of radicalization is not, as is popularized in mainstream media, a turn towards violence, but a tugging at the roots of our assumptions that leads towards transforming our worldview. We need a radical shift in our thinking and assumptions if we are going to become the kind of people and the kind of country where Indigenous people and newcomers are truly welcome and not severed from their history. So we think about colonization, we think about removal, reservation system, epidemics, conflicts, residential schools, child welfare, incarceration, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and two-spirited people. We think about where we fit into those stories, what our ancestors were doing, benefiting from, silent about. What violence did they ignore or justify that we now see differently? A friend of mine who I worked with in child welfare, she stayed a couple of more years than I did, they were talking around Orange Shirt Day, and the residential schools followed by the scoops, and she said, we're appalled by the things that we did, but they thought they were doing the right thing. And she said to her supervisor at this team meeting, I wonder now what we are doing in the name of safety that we are going to be appalled by 20 years from now. And I think about that very particularly right now. What are we doing in the name of safety that many of us are already appalled by? So we think about where we fit in. We think about the violence they ignore or justify. We think about how these stories teach us to see others as threats simply for existing. Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-Blackness, and others have taught us to see certain people as threats simply by the way their skin marks them. So how can we read these stories with the intention of uncovering and understanding these group-differentiated vulnerabilities to premature death, an intention to understand how we externalize the cost of our way of life onto what is truly Indigenous land and the people on it? We don't do this exercise to create shame or guilt. We do it to mark ourselves, to find the harms we've externalized and identify our relationships going forward. What legacies have we inherited that we may be able to transform? We have a responsibility to a population made vulnerable by the policies of many governments, and we owe them our best possible selves. We owe them policies and practices that don't, under the guise of safety or fitting in, make them more vulnerable. My book and my work, Becoming Kin, sounds like an invitation to relationship with Indigenous people, and I apologize for the misunderstanding, but it is truly about inviting those who have come to this place to look at their own history, at the relationships they have inherited, and becoming the kind of people who are good kin to Indigenous people. I'm realizing that I'm running out of time. You're doing great. So I'm just going to wrap up. Oh, sorry, I've got a couple of more things that we can do. So there's things that we can do. We can develop policies and practices that don't assume conformity. When I worked at a refugee settlement house, many of the forms that people had to fill out assumed a particular family structure that made it difficult for them to complete in a meaningful way, but also the way that housing is developed or medical care is practiced, the way we imagine communities and systems of education. These systems are not inevitable. They can be reimagined in all kinds of ways. We have to imagine belonging in a way that does not cut off history. Cut off history is cut off grief, being stuck in perpetual mourning. How do people grieve the things that they're not allowed to talk about? Migrants, arrivants, and Indigenous people wind up with conflicting stories about ourselves. We have images of a past life or a past self that can't be recovered. It's been changed through displacement and trauma. Being unable to share our stories or grief outside of siloed services hampers us. We need to create space for people to share their stories across cultural groups because it helps us to see how we're connected, how global violence is connected. There are also the images that are projected onto us because of perceived histories, because of visible or audible differences. And we don't resolve this with cultural competency trainings that treats everyone from a particular group as interchangeable. I once had a supervisor tell a coworker not to take offense if the Indigenous family she worked with didn't make eye contact because they don't make eye contact. And yet there I was, an Ojibwe woman in the room making eye contact. We need trainings that teach empathy and the capacity to listen. We need organizations to be funded so that their staff truly has the time to invest in relationships and not just process people. If Trudeau can buy a pipeline, am I right? We need to seek opportunities to build relationships between Indigenous communities and newcomers. In response to a meme about how Indigenous people should have had better border control, my friend Daniel Heath Justice, Cherokee, said that the generosity of our ancestors was never the problem. And I know this was something discussed this morning at a roundtable with Travis Angus of the Nisga'a Nation and others, and I have friends in the Palestinian and Muslim communities, and I know that they're struggling right now. So I approached my hand drum group about inviting them in and showing them some care. So we did, and they came. And I don't know what it's going to become. But we need to find ways to build relationships between our communities, and organizations working with newcomers need to build relationships that facilitate that. Friendship centers, I'm going to tell you, are an amazing resource. What if grants or program funds were available that allowed us to host joint programming? Most friendship centers have professional kitchens and childcare space. They have programming that could easily be adapted to include newcomers and migrants. But first, we need to build relationships, and we need to move beyond funding models that perpetuate scarcity and silos. The single Canadian story acts as a filter or a mediator between us, and our focus on individuals rather than communities means that we can't see these group differentiated vulnerabilities created or exploited by the systems we rely on. Externalizing the costs of our society means we don't see the harms accumulate in communities we don't see or notice. We have to see. We have to notice. Canada claims to value multiculturalism, diversity, and inclusion, but to what end? To simply extend the reach of that single Canadian story into people's lives, disconnecting them from their histories, or do we want to invite transformation? Welcoming people as their whole selves, not as model citizens, model minorities, hypercorrect imitators, but as their whole selves. And in that way, we invite transformation. This sounds alarming, threatening even, but Canada is not the same people who settled here 400 years ago. 200 years ago. We are not even the same people of 100 years ago. The legacies of those people live on in the names of buildings and monuments, in policies and laws that still govern how we live, in those state sanctions and extra legal productions and exploitations of group differentiated vulnerabilities to premature death. But our interpretation of those laws and policies, our willingness to make changes, to abolish or repeal the things we recognize as harmful to those made vulnerable by the policies, speaks to a great capacity for change. And change is inevitable. The only real question is what that change will look like. Krawec.
There you go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that on? No?
Well, while Patty's mic gets turned on, thank you so much, Patty. That was brilliant. And I think as I sit and listen and reflect and share some of the experiences that I have on my own journey, I think one of the questions, or one of the things that comes to mind for me, is always that the answers that we receive are based on the questions that are asked. And so who is asking the questions, right? We only get the answers to the questions that are asked. So who is asking the questions? And so when people who look like me and have the privilege that I do are the only ones who are asking the questions to the things that I want to know, then we keep getting the wrong answer. So while people like me have the opportunity and the privilege that we have, it is our mandate, it is our role to ask those questions of the people who aren't able to ask the questions on their own because they're not being listened to. So I challenge everybody in this room who looks like me, ask the questions that we need the right answers to. We do have questions, but we are running a tad late. So I'm wondering if maybe we can just take one of the questions and get some insights from you. And so the question says that you mentioned migration doesn't equate with colonization, but can help support it. Does Canada's immigration policy support colonization? And if so, then how do you see it being decolonized?
Yes, it does. Well, I mean, the Canadian project is still about asserting right to space, talking about settling people in Northern Ontario. Were Indigenous people part of that conversation about settling newcomers on their territory, creating more so-called remote communities? Like, were we part of that conversation? I don't know. Maybe we were. That's a valid question. So yes, I would say that really any country that's accepting a migration is doing it in ways that benefit them, right? Because it's in their end. And I would encourage anybody who wants to know more about that to pick up Harsha Walia's book, Border and Rule. She discusses that in a lot of detail. And I think the only way that an immigration system can be decolonized is if we allow everybody in. If we dispense with criteria around who's acceptable and who's not acceptable, if we just allow, and we're frightened, right? You hear, refugees, the language of water and waste is used to describe refugees, depending, we're going to be flooded. They're described as a flood, or if you go further right on the political spectrum, they're described in terms of garbage, and if we're not going to be flooded, we're not going to be overwhelmed. Canada and the US did that for a long time, allowed anybody who came. And honestly, if we're disrupting societies, these countries overseas, we have a responsibility to provide safety to the people we've disrupted.
That's fab. Thank you, Patty. Thank you so much. I'm going to leave it at that. That was a brilliant keynote, and so grateful for your time this morning.
My book is available out there, and I'm going to head over there. I've got a nice pen for signing. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. And so I do want to go to the video that we have for this session. It's sponsored by the Calgary Catholic Immigration Society, CCIS. So we'll have the video play, and then when we're done that, I'll give you just some updates on the rest of the day, and then we'll go about our morning. So to the video, please.
Fostering New Beginnings, the CCIS story. Since 1981, Calgary Catholic Immigration Society, CCIS, has been a beacon of hope for refugees and immigrants in our community. We stand as a community leader, offering comprehensive services through a diverse team of dedicated professionals, serving newcomers out of 26 locations across Calgary and Southern Alberta. We are deeply rooted in the heart of our communities, ensuring accessible support for all. From employment to family and children's services, we cover it all with over 95 programs and services tailored to every aspect of settlement and integration. Our team a mosaic of cultures comprising more than 450 employees and 2,000 volunteers, collectively speaks more than 70 languages, ensuring every client feels heard, understood, and valued, making CCIS a beacon of diversity and inclusion. In partnership, we empower immigrants and refugees to successfully settle and integrate in our communities. Our vision is to build an inclusive society where immigrants and refugees can reach their full potential. CCIS, transforming lives, one new beginning at a time.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, CCIS.